So this is a video a little more difficult to make since a strong argument can be made for both sides. Whether or not the Targaryen madness is real, it's an interesting thing to talk about. I'll leave it up to you guys to decide by the end of this. In this show, we've been introduced to the alleged hereditary insanity through Viserys and through glimpses of the Mad King Aerys II, his father who died years before the start of Game of Thrones. Since I'm nerdy and have read these books, I know a few more Targaryens that have may also been nuts. Let's talk about these guys. A lot of Targaryens are products of incestuous marriages. It's not surprising there are more crazies than your regular family. Remember, the Dragonlords of Valyria, where the Targaryens originate from, believed marrying within the family kept their magic bloodline pure and powerful. So let's start from the beginning. Aegon the Conqueror married both of his sisters and united Westeros, becoming the first king. He had one son with each sister, and with his older sister Visenya, he had his son Maegor. He was known as Maegor the Cruel, so you can imagine why he's considered one of the Mad Targaryens. He was built stronger and taller than his weak half-brother Aenys, who was born before him. He became a talented warrior doing well in melees and tourneys from a young age. He even single-handedly ended a rebellion in the Vale with his dragon. His older brother was king by this point, and he named Maegor Hand of the King for taking care of the trouble in the Vale. The Faith of the Seven was never cool with some of the Targaryens' customs, so when Maegor took a second wife, the Faith freaked out. Aenys was always a weak king, so he exiled Maegor, thinking he would keep peace. Maegor had always been violent, but his sanity was only questioned after his half-brother died and Maegor returned to Westeros. Maegor, along with his mommy Visenya, plotted and succeeded in taking the Iron Throne for himself, instead of passing it down to Aenys' son. When the Grand Maester protested this move, Maegor decapitated him personally with the Valyrian steel sword Blackfire. Visenya told anyone who had a problem with her son becoming king to step forward and prove themselves. One of the Faith's religious knights challenged Maegor to a trial of 7, which is just a 7 vs 7 trial by combat. Maegor was the only one to survive, but was hit on the head and left in a coma for 30 days. After he woke up, he hopped on his dragon to engulf the Sept in Dragonfire. Everyone inside was killed. The Faith continued to fight with Maegor even after he kept crushing them. He tried to end it by making a law that the Faith of the Seven couldn't have its own army, and anyone caught with a weapon would have a bounty on their head. The Faith would never stop opposing him, but this law would hold them back. After all the fighting, he continued building the Red Keep in King's Landing, where all the kings would from then on live. He wanted secret passages and tunnels built within the castle, but it wouldn't be much of a secret if all the workers knew the ins and outs of it. He rewarded the workers with a huge feast and had them all killed shortly after. But his cruelty would only grow. Having 2 wives weren't enough for Maegor, so he married the mistress he had while in exile, Tyanna of Pentos. For years, he wasn't able to have a child with any of his wives. Then finally, his second wife became pregnant. What was birthed was only an eyeless monstrosity. The Grand Maester, midwives, and septas were all killed after this. Tyanna of Pentos convinced Maegor that the stillbirth was due to his other wife's affair. His wife, the mother of the stillborn, was then also killed along with her entire family. He married 3 more women all on the same day, who had children in the past to prove their fertility, but still no children for Maegor. All he got was more stillborn monstrosities. Tyanna eventually admitted to being responsible for him not having any children by poisoning his other wife. He literally cut her heart out with his sword. After all of his actions, it was hard to find people to support him. He was found dead on the Iron Throne with his wrists cut open. His nephew and the rightful heir was then crowned. A lot of people consider him mad, but can also be said that he was only angry and violent, with no compassion. It wasn't until 100 years later, after his death, another alleged Mad Targaryen would be born. Baelor had a couple of nicknames, Baelor the Beloved or Baelor the Blessed. It's pretty funny knowing the most loved king might have been insane. His extreme devotion to the faith makes him seem like a Game of Thrones Gandhi. He was married to one of his younger sisters when he was 16, but never consummated the marriage. He became the king the next year when his brother died fighting to conquer DORNE. Both sides of this war had hostages, and everyone expected the Dorne's hostages to be killed in King's Landing. Instead, the pious Baelor let them all go and decided to walk to Dorne to free his cousin, Aemon the Dragon Knight, who was captured while in Dorne. Walking barefoot through the desert was a death wish, but he made it to speak with the Prince of Dorne. They arranged 2 marriages between House Martell and Targaryen and finally made peace. Baelor's cousin, Aemon, was still locked away in a cage, however. When the Prince of Dorne offered him a ride back, Baelor refused, saying the gods instructed him to walk by foot. When he walked to where his cousin was imprisoned, his captor handed him the keys to Aemon's cage, but the cage was above a pit of vipers. He believed the gods would protect him and walked into the pit to free his cousin. And of course, he was bit over and over again, but he did manage to reach the cage and unlock it before passing out. It took months, but he did recover from the snake bites. When he returned home, he ended his marriage with his sister, since he was a septon, and septons, like priests, don't marry or have any children. He then placed all 3 of his sisters into a type of imprisonment people would start to call the Maiden Vault. Baelor wanted to preserve their innocence from the evil of the world, but others believed he locked them away within their castle to avoid temptation of the beauty himself. He also began claiming to have visions. Maegor the Cruel may have burned the old sept to the ground, but Baelor saw a great sept that would be built on top of Viserys Hill, a sept that he said he saw in a vision. People would constantly question his decisions, but he would only listen to the High Septon. He would regularly empty King's Landing's treasury to help out the poor. He also attempted to provide tax exemptions for those who ensured the virtue of their daughters by actually using chastity belts. His strange decisions only got dangerous when he began burning books. It wasn't long before he was spending an alarming amount of time praying and fasting. After the High Septon, who influenced a lot of his decisions, died, he had another vision of who should replace him, and this is where his sanity starts to really be questioned. He convinced people to elect just a random guy who couldn't read or write or even recite a prayer. This guy, who became the new High Septon, quickly died of a fever. King Baelor claimed to have seen an 8-year-old boy speaking with doves that answered back to him in the voices of the 7. This kid became the next High Septon. During a 41-day fast, he finally went too far and then ended up killing himself. Like Maegor, it's hard to say if he was truly mad. He was helping a lot of the common people out, but his actions were just not based in reality, and he just happened to be a king. A few years after Baelor the Blessed died, another strange Targaryen was born, Rhaegel. Very little is written about him, other than that everyone believed him to be crazy, and he would be seen dancing around naked. He died choking on a pie, but would have 3 children that I'll get into with the next crazy character. Rhaegel's nephew was Aerion Brightflame. There's not so much of a debate with his sanity. You really get to know his character in George Martin's short story, The Hedge Knight. In front of his father, King Maegor, Aerion was just a normal prince, but everyone else saw him for the monster he was. Aerion's little brother Aegon says he threw his cat into a well, and once came to his room in the night holding a knife up to his little brother's crotch. He joked about removing his genitals so he would become a sister he could marry. During a joust, instead of aiming for the knight, he impaled the horse he was challenging. During that same tourney, he broke the fingers of a girl performing a puppet show because she showed a dragon dying in her performance. He was married to Daenerys Targaryen, one of Rhaegel's daughters. Together, they would have 1 son, but the same year that his son was born, Aerion was psycho enough to drink wildfire and kill himself, believing it would turn him into a dragon. He named that son Maegor. Not very surprising that a cruel monster would admire another cruel monster. When a great council was trying to decide who should be the next king after Aerion's father died, his son Maegor was passed on, even though he was next in line to rule. People were worried he would inherit Aerion's madness, but he was also a small child at the time. Plus, who would want another king named Maegor, a name that represents pain and death? The last 2 I haven't talked about yet is the Mad King and his crazy son Viserys. A strong argument for these 2 is that their madness was a result of extreme circumstances. They wouldn't be the first Targaryens driven mad by tragic events. Rhaegel's other daughter, Aelora, married her twin brother, Aelor, but accidentally killed him somehow, and it drove her into madness. Another example is Helaena Targaryen. She was driven mad after witnessing the murder of her son during the Dance of Dragons. She eventually leapt into some spikes, killing herself. The Mad King Aerys II went through some traumatic stuff, but took things way too far. His parents were siblings, which complicates that argument. He grew up as a regular prince with some bad traits, like being vain and jealous. He became the king at age 18 and wanted to be the greatest king that ever ruled. He would keep thinking of weird schemes to make the realm better, but would quickly lose interest in them and do nothing. Aerys married his sister Rhaegal, which was arranged by their father. After they had Rhaegar together, they had trouble having any more children for years. There were miscarriages, stillbirths, and babies that died shortly after being born. Aerys grew suspicious of his wife and believed all their pregnancy troubles were because of her being unfaithful. His paranoia grew and he began surrounding himself with informers. Just when him and his wife had another child, Aerys' sanity started returning. But unfortunately, the baby died and Aerys lost it. The wet nurse was beheaded, his mistress and her family were tortured to death. Eventually, they would have a successful childbirth and Viserys was born. Aerys' paranoia would only grow again. He feared for Viserys' life, constantly believing someone could harm him. But where the king truly lost his shit was when he was kidnapped in Duskendale. The Lord of Duskendale wanted to negotiate terms with Tywin Lannister about money, and when Tywin, who was the hand of the king, refused, he had King Aerys captured. The defiance of Duskendale lasted half a year. Sir Barristan was able to stealthily free Aerys from his confinement. The people responsible and their entire family were killed, and the woman rumored to be responsible for his abduction had her tongue and private parts ripped out, and then she was burned alive. Aerys no longer allowed himself to be touched, even by his own servants. Uncut and unwashed, his hair grew even longer and more tangled, while his fingernails lengthened and thickened into grotesque yellow 9-inch talons. His judgment became more and more harsher and crueler. He trusted no one, not Tywin, his old friend, not even his wife Rhaegal or son Rhaegar. He believed they all wanted him dead, so he brought Varys to King's Landing to be his master of whisperers. He eagerly wanted dragons to return, but when that failed, he looked to wildfire. Instead of hanging or beheading, Aerys began burning people alive for crimes. He became aroused by watching people die from the flames and became abusive to his wife. He had Ned Stark's father burned alive because of his paranoia and wanted all of King's Landing destroyed by wildfire until Jaime Lannister killed him. By the time of his death, his son Viserys and wife Rhaegal were taking shelter on Dragonstone. Rhaegal always protected Viserys from his father's madness, so we always considered them all lies. After the events of Robert's rebellion, Viserys was declared king by his mother, but Robert sat on the Iron Throne, while he and his sister Daenerys had to flee to Braavos. Viserys was always abusive and somewhat delusional. He never understood the situation he was in. He truly believed he was a king, even though he had nothing. He may not have been as cruel as his father, but he was just as foolish. He got himself killed, not understanding the situation he was in, like always. Daenerys believes Viserys was driven mad by the stress of his exile and the lack of respect. But that doesn't seem like a valid enough reason for his actions. When Sir Barristan explains to Dany why he chose to observe her before serving her, he tells her, "Targaryens have always danced too close to madness. Your father was not the first. King Jaehaerys once told me that madness and greatness are two sides of the same coin. Every time a new Targaryen is born, he said, the gods toss the coin in the air, and the world holds its breath to see how it'll land." Now obviously, 50% of Targaryens are not crazy, but the crazies just happen to get so much attention. The only one I can say without a doubt was mad was Aerion. The rest can be argued either way in my opinion. I'm sure a lot of you guys have strong opinions on this topic, and I'll be interested in reading them. If you want to hear more about Targaryens, you can click on the screen to watch my video on their connection with fire, or if you want to see the entire family tree. Hope you enjoyed this one, and I'll see you guys next time with another Game of Thrones video.